you look at a funding opportunity announcement, and this is part of our like matching process, but they're usually like hundreds of pages long. And on like page 47, you realize you don't qualify. That's heartbreaking, right? Like you've poured hours into this process, and consultants, what the first step they normally do when they engage with the client is they help them identify these opportunities. And we can create a short list that they can then kind of cross-check and verify and save them like literally hundreds of hours, which then saves their clients a lot of money. And that means they can take on more clients. And everybody we've talked to loves this, right? Like they're not trying to like charge their customers like through the roof. It's just a matter of it takes so much time right now. And we can give them the tools to help them do what they're doing faster. It's kind of like superhuman doesn't replace, the human that's writing emails. It's just helping you do your work better.
Hey climbers, welcome back to another episode of Climb by VSC. I'm so excited for today's topic because it is one that's been requested by so many of you, our listeners. Today we're talking about grants and non-dilutive funding. So I invited on Helena Merk, CEO of Streamline Climate. It's a company that sources, qualifies, and drafts applications for climate tech companies. And she's here to chat with me about this topic. Helena, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks, Jay. I'm so excited to be here.
Yeah, this is, like I said, a topic that so many of our listeners, many of whom are founders, have reached out about. With the passage of the IRA, there's so much access to non-dilutive capital. And that's kind of a dream for companies at the early stage of their building. They don't, really quite know where they're at, and they want to find access to this capital. So before we dive into all of that, you've been here in New York for Climate Week. You've spoken on some panels. You've been in a lot of events. Let's start with like a fun icebreaker. What is something new that you've learned this week that you'd like to share?
So many things. I think one thing on the topic of grants is that every single panel kind of devolves into a conversation about grants.
Really?
Not devolves. I think it just ends up being one of those like pain points that anybody kind of resonates with if they've even come close to the problem.
Yeah.
From finding your first opportunity to like writing it. And then the kind of zinger that people don't even realize is once you've won the grant, even the managing of it takes up all your time.
Yes.
So every kind of conversation ends up there, and it's very validating, but also very painful. And it just kind of gives our whole team like the sense of urgency of like, oh gosh, like we really have to build.
Yeah, this is clearly very much top of mind. Like I said, not just for our listeners, but even all the folks here at New York Climate Week. So before we dive into all of that, I want folks to get to know you a little bit. So let's talk about Helena. Let's talk about that journey. This is not your first rodeo as a CEO of a venture-backed company. So how did you find yourself in this big, hairy world of grants and non-dilutive funding? Talk to me about that journey.
Yeah, I have no idea. So like, I think my journey is pretty all over the place. I think you see that with a lot of founders. I grew up mostly in the Bay Area, moved there from Germany as a kid, taught myself to code in middle school, and kind of was always tinkering on stuff. And I think for me, building a company is kind of an extension of like building a product and like solving problems and putting things in people's hands. And kind of caught my first like addiction to that when like mobile apps were kind of launching. Started building mobile apps, did a lot of like mobile app building for animal shelters, and realized pretty quickly I was allergic to everything outside. So I should probably stick to the software side of the climate equation. And then throughout high school, got involved in kind of more and more software startups, and almost didn't go to college. Decided that I should probably do that, would be good professionally. Realized a year and a half into that, it was not that useful professionally and dropped out. But during that time, kind of explored more of the hardware side of things. I studied biomedical engineering and was kind of exploring pre-veterinary stuff, did some work with elephants and cheetahs that we can dive into, but pretty much all over the place, kind of always trying to juggle like on the ground work with software. And I think the fast-paced nature of software was always kind of more attractive. So I ended up dropping out to join a startup called Smart Car. They do API for cars. So if you've heard of like Turo and GetAround, they would kind of build on top of Smart Car. And that was so much fun. Like I was literally just like reverse engineering these cars and like hacking into cars. And my friends were like, what are you doing? Go back to school. And I was like, no, I'm having a good time. While I was there, I started my first company called Glimpse. It was a video chat company that helped remote teams connect. And we built that during the pandemic, which was very timely.
Very timely. I mean, all the colleges that went remote, all the companies that went remote. Yeah.
So I think very much like a series of like lucking out on timing. And then we ended up selling the company in the beginning of 2022. And I think I finally had the time to like step back, and think about how do I want to apply software to climate? Whereas before I think I had like a bit of imposter syndrome with, can I actually make an impact from like a software perspective?
Yeah. I mean, I really appreciate you sharing that, because I feel like so many times when I have conversations with my guests, it's sort of this idea of like, you're only one person, right? Like how much, when you truly grok the scale of this problem, you truly grok the scale of emissions, not only that we're emitting every year, but that we've already put up there, it kind of makes any person want to turtle up. And so I'll start by saying I'm always inspired when I meet and talk to entrepreneurs that go, yeah, I know I'm only one person, but like, I can do something. I want to go do something. And so it's nice to hear you say that, like, yeah, you get to take a step back and kind of grapple with that.
Yeah, and I think most people who start working in climate, they have this like moment where they have like a crisis. They're just like, oh gosh, this is too big. I can't make an impact. I wonder, like, did you have that experience yourself?
Yeah, I did. I actually had that when I first watched a video by one of our most recent guests, Fred Lalonde. He was actually here earlier this week. He did a talk called The Collapse of the Carbon Cycle. Oof. And I watched this probably 2 months ago. And I had been now investing in climate for years, but I think I kind of dove into the innovation side of it, and then I finally started pulling back and understanding more of the science. And as I was understanding more of the science, I found this talk. And as I found this talk, we talked about like we are at very dangerous levels of breaking millennia old like carbon regeneration cycles that the ocean is already doing, that the trees are already doing because of man-made emissions. Like it's no longer debatable. Yeah. And it's not just that we have to deal with the stuff that we're putting out, like I said, now, it's that we're not even feeling the effects of what we're putting on now. We're not going to feel that for 30 more years. And my wife and I just like watched it, and we sat and talked for like 90 minutes, 2 hours. We have a 6-month-old son. Oh my gosh. Like talked about like
yeah. What is 30
future? Years, right? Oh, he's going to be our age when he's feeling the effects of the things that not two people, but like our generation is putting out now. And yeah, it rightfully scares people. But I think there's sort of two reactions, right? When you're scared of something, you can run away from it or you run towards it. And I've chosen to run towards it. I know you've chosen to run towards it. So I part of doing this show also for me is like kind of energizing people to run towards it. But yeah.
Like optimism inducing. Like you can.
You have to. It's not even you can. You have to.
Yeah, you
like,
must,
right? Like what's the alternative? You have to. You have to do things. You have to dedicate your life to doing something. It might as well be this, right? And so I guess on that topic, I'll bring it back to kind of what we want to talk about today, which is grants. Help folks understand the scale of just the opportunity in grants and non-dilutive funding, because everybody hears about the IRA, the $1.7 trillion, all these big numbers get thrown around. But when you have numbers that big, I think the human mind kind of can't comprehend, like, what does this mean for me? And so what does this mean for startups and companies that are out there in terms of the scale of the funding that's available?
Yeah, it's completely understand. I mean, it's, yeah, like you were saying, like you can't really imagine the scale of it. I think you start to really think about it when you look at what solar has done in the last 10 years, right? Like I think that's how we started looking at the IRA. It's like, what is now possible that wasn't before? And can we look at patterns from, the clean tech boom like 10 years ago and how that all evolved? And you look at, pros and cons of that like first like investment cycle. You have Tesla and then you have like Solyndra, right? And like that same scale is going to happen now, and we're going to make mistakes, but we are also going to have massive successes. And the scale of this like level of government funding is way bigger. And I think it's just like the tip of the iceberg of what we're going to see. Yeah. I mean, the IRA alone, there's about like 400 billion just in direct incentives, and that'll, other estimates like increase that around to 800 billion because a lot of the incentives are uncapped. But again, like I think this is just like the tip of the iceberg, and we're going to see a lot more investments kind of coming in various forms. And that's just on public funding. And typically what happens is like you have a wave of public funding, and then various like private funding kind of comes up on top of that.
Yep.
And that's kind of what we're seeing, where everyone's this like in this frenzy to get non-dilutive capital. And I think part of the frenzy is that other types of capital has been harder to access.
Yeah.
Like a lot of venture funding is slower right now. So people are like, okay, finally go after grants. And for the first time, we're kind of seeing VCs themselves encouraging their portfolio companies to go after grants. And if you remember like a year and a half ago, like a lot of the founders we talked to, they're like, oh yeah, my VCs totally flip-flopped on this. Like they used to tell founders, don't apply for grants. And now the narrative has changed. They're like, get any money you can. Grants are actually great. Like, don't worry about the strings attached. You should go for it. You should hire a grants team. You should outsource grant writing, like do whatever it takes to kind of get your piece of that pie.
Why do you think that is? I mean, you speak to VCs regularly. You speak to founders who have VC funding regularly. Why has that narrative changed in terms of VCs directing their companies to go out and access these grants?
I don't know. I mean, part of it is like you have to think about the incentives of who's giving this advice, right? So VCs used to say, go raise more equity or take my money, basically. So maybe there's part of like, it's in their benefit to dilute founders almost and kind of go after equity funding. Now I think they have less funds to deploy. An existing investor on a cap table might be saying, go get non-dilutive funding, it helps my money go further.
Yeah.
That might be one. The others, like there's just like less VC investments kind of across the board with the current like macroeconomic.
Which is so funny to think about because there's more VC funds in the last 3 years than there have ever been. And yet the funding is down 6 quarters, quarter over quarter. So yeah, it's kind of that weird thing of like, there's a lot of money out there. It's just not being deployed.
And it's interesting. And I'm curious like what your thoughts are here. I was like at a dinner a few nights ago and I heard a few VCs talking about this and they're like, yeah, well, the kind of the metrics that you now need to raise a seed round are what you used to need to raise a Series A in 2021.
Yes.
And like, that's interesting. And for climate, a lot of these companies aren't going to be profitable for a long, long time, especially if they're doing something in deep tech.
I'll rephrase that, Helena. The metrics that you needed to raise a seed today are the same as they were in 2018.
Yes.
Now is
but 2021 was like a weird
right. Now is not the anomaly. 2018 was not the anomaly. 2021 was the anomaly because of all the zero interest rates and all the money that's out there. And ultimately what happens is it's supply and demand, right? These are capital markets. And in markets, when there is a lot of supply of capital, then the demand gets repriced and everybody, raise rounds at crazy high valuations with not a lot of traction. The vast majority of those companies are back in market because it's been 18 to 24 months since they raised their rounds. And they are grappling with the fact that they don't have the traction to actually meet the expectations, right? This is something and so I'm really more saying it for our listeners. Folks don't realize that when they take venture capital, they're signing up for 3x growth between now and their next round. And if you don't feel like you can hit that, you don't feel like you want to grind to hit that, or not even want to, you are at a phase of your company where you're still sort of figuring things out and you can't really guarantee that you're going to get that, like understand that then you will be judged for not being able to hit it, right?
Yeah.
And that to me actually comes back to why I think this topic is so interesting, is that we are now trying to solve problems in the world of atoms, not bits. This shit just takes longer.
Yeah.
It just takes longer. It's harder. Things break, physical things break. They are harder to fix than code. And so if it takes longer, that fundamentally breaks the VC model, or at least the time horizons of the VC model, which says every 24 months, your company raises a new round of funding. Every VC gets a little bit of a markup. They all feel good because the company's doing better. The company and the employees' equity gets better. Well, if you extend that from 24 to 36, that last year is really difficult on everybody. Your fund, the employees, the founders, right? And ultimately the customers, because you're not able to serve them in the way you want to serve them because you don't have the money. So my perspective on this is really just like that grant funding is a bridge to that next round. And I think the reason VCs are changing their tune is they're just realizing that either the non-dilutive funding is going to bridge it, or I'm going to have to.
Right.
And I'd rather not. And so let's look at this other option. But it's more necessity than it is like greed. You know what I mean?
No, totally. I think it's very much necessity. And that's like when you're looking at the capital needs for any of these like physical world deployments, the timescales are different, the capital needs are different. Like you're going to need more money. And if you were to do it all with equity, like founders would have none of it left, right? Yeah. And then you have a whole incentives problem there to begin with. Yeah. And what we're kind of seeing just like numbers wise is like founders in physical environments are raising like $1 of grant funding for every $1 of venture. Really? And that has been like a pretty interesting trend. And, however much that will scale as companies grow is, it seems to still be staying at that like 50-50 mark, which is interesting. And then the other thing we're seeing is like, and this is like, I don't know if you've read like CDVC's newsletters, like the capital stack that climate companies are kind of architecting looks so different, than any like Silicon Valley based like SaaS startup, right? It's like you need to kind of stack, loans and debt and grants, and then you got a little bit of VC funding, and it just ends up being this like very complicated stack where you're matching the type of capital to the type of projects you're working on.
Yep. And being a capital structure nerd myself, where that money sits also matters, right? Because you may have an operating company that's where your employees get paid and they have their 401ks and all this stuff, but then you have another entity that is your manufacturing entity, right? And that can take on different levels of debt and capital in a way that operating company can't. So
and then you spin up like an SPV for every single deployment. Right?
Yeah. There's ways to get funky with it, but instead of, I think, doing that, let's highlight for folks what the grant process looks like today. Because from my, I'll say, cursory like insight into this, it is so convoluted and like backdoor handshake and like kind of what you in your mind would think corruption is, but like it's totally legal. So like, how exactly are these grant dollars allocated today? Take me from like step one to, when the money actually hits the bank.
Yeah, I mean, before I answer that, let me answer the backdoor corruption and kind of, because I think that's a narrative that a lot of people have.
Yeah.
And I think we hosted a panel this week, and the questions that kind of kept coming up is like, how do I like get in the door? And like, people who are issuing grants are humans, right? They're working for the government. They're working for the public good. Like, they have their phone numbers listed. They have their emails listed. Talk to them, right? Like, they're trying to build something that is good for the public good, and they're funding public goods.
Yeah.
That's their job. And I think that's like something worth emphasizing, and I don't think it's talked enough about. And what that means in practice is like, you're a founder or, grant writer or some kind of public policy person at your company developing this strategy. Go build that relationship. Mm-hmm. It's a long-term relationship. Start applying for grants early. Even if the grant funding amount, like, I don't know, you're applying for the NSF SBIR, it's only $275K, feels like nothing when like you need millions. Do that, because that the ROI of that is so much more than the $275K, right? It's a relationship with the NSF, right? And that helps you get then the DOE funding, and then so on and so forth. So I'd say like, that's probably like one of the biggest misconceptions actually, is like, it's just like opaque behind the scenes, like, situation. And I'd say it's just like every other relationship where you have to build it over time.
But it can feel that way, right? When you have, these grants and these program managers that are putting together grants that then have to like, they write the grant, but oftentimes they write the grant to suit the needs of people that they have already met. Yeah. So that they can win the grant. And this is the thing that folks don't realize. Like, it's not like venture capital where like, if I only meet one company in a space, but I think that's the best company, like I'll just go back to that company, right? And I have no concerns that maybe I haven't met all the other competitors in the space. When it comes to public funding and public allocation, it has to be an open process. And but it doesn't always feel like an open process.
It does not. It definitely does not. Like, we see sometimes like an agency will like put like an RFP or request for proposal out with like a 2-week deadline. Yeah. It's a very niche topic, and you're like, you wrote this for somebody. Yeah. Right. So I guess to think about that process, like, they engaged with somebody weeks prior, months prior, and that was without your knowing. Which I guess goes back to the earlier statement I made, which is like, go talk to them early. Right? Like, be that person that they're writing a grant for. And like, this is nowhere near the optimal system. Yeah. But know that like, they're trying their best, and being frustrated at how it works isn't helpful. Just go educate yourself, basically, on how this process works. And typically the way that they're developing the RFPs, the request for proposals, is they first do like an RFI, a request for information. Okay. Right? So they will kind of solicit the public, because they're not experts in direct air capture, right? They're going to say, hey, what is possible? What should we be funding? So it's kind of imperative that you go and respond to that RFI, and you tell them, hey, this and this and this and that is what you should be putting into your grant making. Now they go back and they come up with, this is the proposal we're going to put out. Please submit your solicitation. Submit your proposals to the solicitation. Yes. And I think that first step, the RFI step, so most startups are skipping. Really? Because if you're looking at the time span, and that's like a huge frustration with grants, right? It's like, you submit your grant proposal in like January, you hear back and they tell you May, and then it turns out it's September, right? And then you get announced, you get your funding starting like January. And if you're starting out with like an 18-month runway, you look at the system and you're like
12 months on it.
Oh my goodness, I ran out of money. Like, I'm dead now. So it becomes really challenging to justify getting involved even before that process in the RFI system. And that's something that at Streamline, we want to help do, just programmatically kind of behind the scenes. Yeah. Because you're not going to take a step away from your day-to-day operations. Things are on fire. You just want to go do the science to like submit an RFI for potentially getting an RFP, which you might or may not, most likely you won't win.
Well, the irony of all this is like, you are a startup with limited resources. This sounds like somebody's full-time job.
Yes.
And so now, in addition to my CTO, director of engineering, head of product, head of design, I also need to go hire a head of grant writing. who hopefully he or she will do enough good grant writing that they will cover not only their costs, but also a little bit, you know what I mean? Like you have to, actually the grant success has to be that much higher because you have to cover the cost of the person who is spending all day doing this work.
Yeah, it's a full-time job. And then as companies scale, I mean, often they'll start with like outsourcing this job. Then they usually bring it in-house and they have multiple grant writers. Like they have a whole team.
Yeah.
And this isn't something that only startups are dealing with. Like large public companies do this too, right? They have full grant writing teams.
Yep.
And we think that's like not the best use of resources, public funding or private. It just seems like a lot of, I mean, that's the whole premise of our company, right? It's like, I think a lot of that can be kind of automated and streamlined.
Yeah. And folks hear these terms like SBIR phase 1, SBIR phase 2, STTR, a lot of acronyms. One of the things we like to do on the show is like demystify them a little bit. What are SBIR and STTR and how are they different? And then what are these phases that everybody talks about?
Yeah, SBIR, SBIR, Small Business Innovation and Research Grant. It's a grant that helps you kind of de-risk your business. Okay. What makes it unique from other grants is I think worth highlighting. And I think a lot of people get wrong when they're applying to it. So if you're coming from an academic background, often like grants are helping you do research.
Yes.
For the sake of research.
Yes.
For the sake of public knowledge and expanding our awareness about a thing, which is awesome. SBIR has a very specific purpose, which is to help businesses. And it only is awarded to for-profit entities. Yep. You can't win as a nonprofit.
Yep.
And it's supposed to be kind of this catalytic capital that helps you prove a key piece of your business and show that you can make revenue and become profitable. And if you can't kind of tell the narrative of how this research will help you become like a business that makes money for your for-profit, like Delaware C Corp, you're not really qualified for it.
Yep.
And that's kind of the gist of it. And like a phase 1 qualifies you for the phase 2. It is something that every federal agency operates in their own program. So like an NSF will have an SBIR program, so will the DOE and kind of all of them.
DOD and yeah, exactly. So every one of these departments has a pool of money for SBIR, right? And then each phase is like gated to say, okay, you've accomplished this milestone and now you're phase 1 or like what are those milestones?
They're kind of self-prescribed,
okay,
which is interesting. I mean, you need to, in your own like scope of work, come up with something that's actually reasonable. I mean, if you think about it, like $275K, it's not a lot of money, right? Like you hire like a scientist or two, and you're like being super frugal. The goal of the phase 1 is really to prove that you can take on a larger phase 2. It's really like a de-risking exercise. Okay. And then that phase 2 is usually around $1 million. Yeah. Which is still like on the smaller end, so a lot of like smaller companies go after this. But then after you kind of go through this process, you get to know all these people. And then you start to go after like the really large DOE grants and after some of the newer programs that exist today. Yeah.
And then how is that different from a STTR, STTR, right?
They're very similar. Okay. I think the only real distinction is like, are you doing it as your own entity or are you spinning it out of like an academic institution?
Got it.
But yeah, those nuances are just, you pretty much qualify for one or the other if you're like building a company. Yeah.
When you spoke at a panel this week, you talked about, you and I think your other panelists talked about the idea that most of these grants or most of these companies that are applying for grants should have a co-sponsor or a co-partner, right? If you're building somewhere out in Oklahoma, you might need to work with the First Nations there as a co-sponsor of your grant. Talk about this like co-sponsoring thing. What is it? Why is it so important? And how should startups think about doing this early in that process?
Yeah, for the SBIR, like the SBIR process, it's like less common. Like you can pretty much apply for it as your own entity and do your thing, right? Yeah. But if you start looking at like other grants and opportunities, like again, put on the hat of like you're in the government. Your entire intention is to like help the public. And if you see one grant application that's like, hey, you're a for-profit company trying to just print money. And then you see another one where it's like, oh, we have this whole community engagement plan. Like we're pulling in these like local communities, working with disenfranchised groups, and that's how we're executing it. Like you're going to pick the second one, right? So think about that when you're applying for your grants is like, how can I do what I'm doing, achieve my company's goals, but also help the public? Because that is what the funding is for. It's public funding. So was that kind of the question, or were you asking more about the matching funds?
It was. And it actually reminds me of a company in our portfolio that has been actually the most successful in terms of accessing these grants, partly because of what their product is, but then also who their product serves. So they're called Sesame Solar. They're based in Jackson, Michigan, and they are doing renewable renewably powered nanogrids. So the quick 30 seconds is like when there's a climate disaster, let's say there's a hurricane or a flood or, an avalanche or whatever. What's the first thing people do? They show up with diesel generators to try to get power up and running again. It's like we are actively making the problem worse at the site of the collapse, right? Like, why does it make any sense? Yeah. It is, and it's a sad irony. And I think Lauren and the team at Sesame were like, there has to be a better way, and there is. And so what they did was they took hitch trailers, right, 17, 18-foot hitch trailers, or even the size of a shipping container, covered them on basically all sides with solar panels, made the solar panels retractable so they can kind of, adjust to where the sun is and where the opportunity is. And if there's not sun, it's a cloudy day, whatever, they have green hydrogen batteries that they can rely on for backup. But they can get these rapidly deployed into communities. Folks can shower, charge their phones, get access to medical and healthcare. And the customers that are buying it are the cities and the counties themselves, but then also corporations that operate in those areas to say, look, if something happens to my community, it's not okay for these people to be homeless or not have all these access because they work at my company, right? Ultimately, if I'm in Philadelphia, a lot of employees of Comcast are in Philadelphia. And so therefore I need to be servicing this community. They've been very successful with accessing not just SBIR, but also desert grants because by virtue of who they serve, right? They're serving the public community. Not every company is like this.
Correct.
And so I think the part of it is like, when I said at the top of the conversation of what Streamline does, it's like sourcing, qualifying, and writing. That qualifying piece, I think, becomes the hardest part for a lot of startups because you naturally feel like, well, I should be able to apply for all of these. And realistically, like you're probably not qualified for most of them.
Yeah, you're going to waste a lot of time with that strategy.
Yeah. So let's talk about Streamline then in that process. Where do you come in that process for these startups? I know you're sort of still early in your journey and you're building the platform out, but what part of this somewhat antiquated grant approval process is Streamline trying to really change?
I mean, eventually all of it, I hope. I think we want to really take that mental gymnastics off of the plate of a founder or an early stage team, and then also accelerate that work for larger companies down the road.
Yeah.
But really it starts with, on our end, in kind of ingesting everything on the policy side, right? Not only understanding what are the grant opportunities, but what led to that, right? Who pushed for this and what are their incentives and what are they actually looking for in an application? What are the historic awardees if it's a program that's been running for a while? And what can we learn from the past successes mostly? Because the successes are public, the failures not so public. So who tends to win this? And can we help find who else should be applying in the future?
Yeah.
So that's kind of the backbone of Streamline. And then when companies are applying to it, the first step is they kind of upload onto our platform just all their past grants. And if they don't have grants, it can be white papers, it can be, RFPs. Hopefully they have something.
Yeah.
If they don't have anything, we can't help them at this time. But they upload their content and we create a private, secure environment for their data. And we're not using it to train models. I know that's the number one question. And then figure out in this matchmaking scheme, what do they qualify for immediately, right? That's a pretty easy check once you have everything turned into structured data. But then the more interesting part is helping them actually plan out their grant strategy, right? Because we were talking, these timelines are long.
Yes.
So you need to really get involved in the RFI process to help shape what grant policies exist in the first place. To plan out your 18 to 24 month grant strategy, we need to know your own internal roadmap and your timelines.
Yep.
Right? So your company's deployment strategy is X, and then we figure out how much wiggle room is there here. Does it strategically make sense to diverge from this to go after a grant opportunity? Often it doesn't, right? You want to go after opportunities that are very much aligned with your existing roadmap.
Yep.
So that's kind of the planning piece. And then once opportunities are identified, we can actually help with the drafting of it as well, right? So it's okay, the proposal is asking for this. Usually it's very prescriptive. It's tailor-made for you or you don't apply, right?
Yeah.
So it's tailor-made. We help kind of translate your existing IP into that setup. And then you go ahead and submit it. And then what we're going to work on next is once you win the grant, actually managing all the compliance and reporting, right? Because that's a whole other beast in and of itself.
Yeah.
It's totally. Sending these quarterly reports.
Because I think what most folks don't understand is you don't just get a check for $275K. Like it's tranched, right? It's doled out based on certain milestones.
Correct. And this came up on the panel as well, but like you kind of define those milestones, right?
Yourself. So I set my own milestones.
You set your own milestones. I mean, they're not going to approve a project that has like silly milestones.
Yeah.
But like you can make your own reporting easier if you create tranches that make sense and are aligned and have a bit of flexibility, right? If they're super specific and you end up learning something, which I hope you do during your process, you might have to pivot your milestones and then it's going to be a whole nightmare.
Yeah.
But typically the way that you get these funds is like you spend the funds, then you ask for reimbursement and you kind of submit these receipts, and people always file the receipts wrong because it's like just super bespoke. And I don't know, I think we've heard these like horror stories where like somebody submitted on the receipt that like they got a meal and they got like an alcoholic beverage with their meal, like a beer. And that was just not allowed. So the entire like the file for reimbursement was just canceled. And it's like, that sucks, right? Like you had one beer with your dinner and now you can't get reimbursed and your entire project is delayed. So there's a few kind of ways around this. One, don't drink beer, but
which like why is the federal government policing what kind of alcohol I can have?
I mean,
Like,
it's just
crazy.
kind of like one example of like how specific you have to file it. And this is where companies like Enduring Planet, actually, they were on our panel, like come in. They help create that bridge funding for like working capital between like you needing to spend the funds and then getting reimbursed.
Yeah. That drafting process, the grant writing process, my understanding is today it's largely done by consultants, folks that maybe were program managers previously, have now spun off into the private sector and are helping folks. You know, they were a DoD program manager. If you're applying for a DoD grant, they're like kind of the expert you have to go to. Like anything, I think as a VC, as an entrepreneur, I love to like take anything a consultant is doing and turn it into software. So like I think that's a great idea. But like, what is it that those consultants are doing that, you know, Streamline thinks could be streamlined, for lack of a better word?
Yeah, I mean, I guess one thing I'll preface with is like we work with a lot of consultants.
Okay.
Like there are design partners. We love collaborating with them. I think there's very much limits to what can be automated.
Okay.
In something that's a creative process like this. I think the piece that we can help with is all the stuff they had to do. And that makes me very happy.
Yeah.
And one of those things is like, you look at a funding opportunity announcement, and this is part of our like matching process, but they're usually like hundreds of pages long. And on like page 47, you realize you don't qualify. That's heartbreaking, right? Like you've poured hours into this process.
Yeah.
And consultants, what the first step they normally do when they engage with the client is they help them identify these opportunities. And we can create a short list that they can then kind of cross-check and verify and save them like literally hundreds of hours, which then saves their clients a lot of money. And that means they can take on more clients. And everybody we've talked to loves this, right? Like they're not trying to like charge their customers like through the roof. It's just a matter of it takes so much time right now. And we can give them the tools to help them do what they're doing faster.
Yep.
It's kind of like superhuman doesn't replace the human that's writing emails. It's just helping you do your work better. And we are very kind of cognizant of like the limitations of generative AI right now, where like, let's say we draft the first draft. It's not awesome, right? Like I'm not going to tell you like, we're going to apply to all these grants for you and will you money. Like, no, that's not what we're doing at all, right? It's like we generate a first draft that kind of repurposes your past applications, but you need a human driving this and you need an expert driving this.
Yeah.
Thus far, like, I mean, we're early and we've only engaged with people who are experts in grant writing, right? Either they're in-house grant writers that have won millions before, or they're these grant like consultants that like are these expert drivers of what I would say is a powerful technology, but like you need to be an expert to do it. And I think it's similar to like, if like, there's all these like legal tech generative AI companies, you still want a lawyer, right? 100%. Same thing here. Like we're not at the stage yet where anything like that is possible.
Yeah, and I think the challenge with some of the grant writing aspect is like experience really matters, right? It's like, to your point, you have to see who's won before. You have to understand why things have gotten rejected. Like at a certain point, like you could be a good writer, but to be a grant writer is a very specific thing. And I think that's the challenge that a lot of startups who want to access this face is that the learning curve is so steep that you're almost forced to go work with somebody. And again, that feels a little bit antithesis to like how Silicon Valley does things, like, radical self-reliance and like actually going after these opportunities and being scrappy. when it comes to interfacing with government, I feel like Scrappy kind of hits a wall, and it feels it can feel demoralizing, right? Because you look out there and you go, how is this company winning a grant? Because we know what we're doing is innovative and it's this and it's that. And I think for a founder, because we've had founders that have applied for grants that have gotten rejected, that seemed like this was like the right fit. But to your point, because they weren't as part of the RFI, the grant wasn't written for them. It was for somebody else entirely.
Which is just so sad.
Yeah. What about this process do you think would like really surprise people or blow their minds? Like what's one thing you've learned as you've like dove deep into this grant world that you're like, I cannot believe that's how it happens.
I mean, I feel like every turn we take is like another surprise, honestly.
Really?
And I mean, I shared my story. Like, I'm not from a grant writing background. So I think one of the questions is like, how did you get here? And it's like, I don't know. We talked to hundreds of founders, and grants is like what came up over and over and over again. And it's something that feels very opaque, and we're learning as we're going. And that's part of why we've like collaborated so closely with the experts in building this tool, and kind of leaned on their support for doing this. I think, like the beer story is something that one of our like design partners shared with us. And I was like, oh, wow, like cool. I guess our next set of features is going to be in helping you do the compliance and reporting, because this is painful, right? And that's a surprise. So like there's constantly just like more surprises.
Yeah, totally. If you could snap your finger today and change one thing about how the grant application process is done, you know, queen for a day, mayor for a day, whatever you want to call it.
Goodness, too much power.
but if you could create sort of one like snap of a finger lasting change, what would you change about that process?
And I kind of think a lot of it has to be overhauled.
Okay.
I think the information, I mean, the crux of the problem I see is like the information transfer between industry and government.
Yeah.
And it's something that we're building towards, right? So it's like, you can imagine fast forward, I don't know, a year or 2 years, I don't know how long it'll take us, but we're able to help a lot of companies apply for these grants, which means we have a good pulse check of like what's possible, what's happening in R&D, and how policy should be shaped to kind of foster the next wave of innovation. We can kind of do continuous RFIs almost, and kind of create like a continuous like information system that can help shape policy. Versus right now, it's like the government says, I'm going to like go fishing. And like, what is this next? Like, like I'm going to send an RFI to like help shape this policy. But in reality, like they should have a continuous pulse on what's happening. And that is, has just not been possible.
Yeah. As AI technology comes out, you shouldn't have to wait for an RFI. You should already be having sort of a pipeline of here's how AI is impacting the concrete industry. Here's how it's impacting, you know, roads and EV chargers and got it. So that's sort of the idea of like a continuous exchange of information. Yeah,
I think it should be continuous. And I think like other parts of that is like knowing all the different grant programs. I mean, I think there's a good amount of companies working on this, and we hope to partner with them, which is like even knowing like what to apply for on like the super hyper local level. Because if you look at how like funding is dispersed, it's like, cool, the IRA federal bill, right? It goes down to states.
Yep.
Then it goes down to local governments.
Yep.
Right. And then finally to companies. The way most software companies, or like, I guess most companies kind of are deploying, is like they're operating at a technology level and they're trying to figure out where do they deploy. Yeah. So they need to kind of do this like, not to be too computer sciencey, but like depth first search, right? Like you need to go super local to figure out, oh, where can I like go install my like EV charging stations, and look at every single city's policy. But to do that, like you literally go to like every city's website. You can't like search across all policies and then figure out, how do I build my planning tool
across these things?
No.
Wow.
None at all. And every single website looks different. So it's been a process that has been impossible to automate until language models.
Can't even like do a scraper. Like it doesn't even make sense to do that.
Well, now you can't, right? Because of language models.
Yeah.
Like you can build agents that go and kind of scrape these sites and like build up a database of forever changing information. That has literally not been possible before. You have companies like, I don't know if you're familiar with like Nira or Paces, where for them, so Paces builds like planning tools around renewable energy. Yep. For them to build a planning tool for where to deploy solar, they've literally had to manually go and source all the different permitting processes from every single local government.
Yeah.
And they do that.
It's tedious.
It's tedious. Oh my goodness. And then they do that over and over again, like every 6 months, because these processes change.
Yeah.
There's no like collected databases. And now you can, I'm imagining companies like them are starting to like automate these scraping tools. But I don't know. I feel like that's like a very inefficient way of doing this.
Yeah. So is your view that more founders should be applying for grants? Like how much money are folks typically leaving on the table when they write this process off, where they say, listen, this is too tedious, it's not for me? I want folks to understand whether like this is something they should be allocating time and energy towards. And I guess the second part of that is, one, should they be doing it? But two, what's the success rate like? Is it 1 out of 10, 1 out of 100? Like there's, I'm sure, a ton of applications, but for somebody who spends the time and energy to go and write a grant, what kind of hit rate should they be expecting?
Yeah, I mean, the unfortunate answer is it depends.
Okay.
Which is like,
yeah,
I kind of call that, but like, I think like for every grant, there's like a different level of competitiveness.
Mm-hmm.
The more local you go, partially because of the problem I just described, where nobody knows where the local grants are, they're hard to find, they're less competitive. But that also means to the people who are grant makers and approving the grants, like they're getting less qualified applicants and less like companies to choose from.
Yeah.
I'd say it's, for most companies, they are probably missing out on opportunities. Currently, there's not enough tools to know how much.
Yeah.
Like there's literally no way of knowing how much money you're missing. And I think that itself creates a lot of anxiety in founders,
Yes.
right? Like they reach out to me like, Helena, like, what should I apply for? Like, am I missing out on all this money? I was like, I don't know, right? Like we'll build a tool and we'll help you figure it out. But like right now, there's like really no good way of knowing how much you're missing out on.
Yeah. That is very exciting. Because, again, we talked about at the top of this conversation, $400 billion out of those $1.7 trillion in these direct incentives, uncapped. So that could be actually twice as much once you really get down to it. And yet no standardization across state, federal, and local, no easy understanding of how folks should really be accessing it. Consultants who are there, they're there to help you. They want to help you, but they're siloed because DOD is different than DOE, is different than NSF. And ultimately, a massive time constraint on startup founders who are trying to move faster than any company, in their sphere. It naturally feels like these processes are kind of like designed to be against each other. You know what I mean? Like they don't really work together. And yet here are all these VCs that are telling you,
Go apply for grants.
Go
move fast and apply for grants.
Go apply for grants. Yeah, I think that's sort of been my biggest learning in kind of doing this dive the last couple of months is like, it's not enough to say, go apply for grants as an investor, right? I can't feel right just going to my company and saying, well, why haven't you applied for grants, until you actually try to go through the process yourself. And we've done that with one of our companies, like tried to actually like work with them, be kind of co-pilot or sitting shotgun in the car with them as they're going through this process. And you just realize how much time and energy it takes from somebody. It's somebody's full-time job.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'd like to close where we like to close with a lot of our guests, which, knowing everything you know about this process, knowing everything that you know about how these dollars are allocated, what is something that still gives you hope about grants, non-dilutive funding, and how they're going to accelerate our fight against climate change?
I feel like everyone's fighting the same battle. Like, I think finally, like, there's money out there. There's policies that are going in the right direction. And yes, there could be more, like, yes, it could be easier to access, but like the amount of funding that's suddenly available is very uplifting. Yeah. And then just like personally, like what's super optimistic and interesting is like every single person we're talking to is like changing the world. Like we get to kind of be, and I'm assuming like it's probably very similar as a VC, but it's like every founder I talk with or like team I'm engaging with is like doing something remarkable, and we help them like achieve that goal with more capital. And that's very fulfilling.
Yeah, it's really exciting for me. I think being in this space, as I mentioned, as a new dad, I kind of like think about what am I waking up and doing every day, and how is it like making our immediate world better, in addition to obviously the world we all share. I think what really excites me, especially given where our fund comes in and helps on storytelling and content and media, is realizing like climate has a massive storytelling problem. And you see the billions of dollars being spent every year by oil and gas, by commercial real estate, by all these industries trying to tell people, hey, everything's okay. Or if we change something, you're all going to lose your jobs. And we're just one small fund and we're just one small group of people. But the fact that we're kind of like pushing back in the opposite direction, more than anything, that excites me. Because I feel like the David versus the Goliath, to say, look, it's me and all these climate founders, and we're fighting back against folks that have billions more dollars. But to your point, like the playing field is finally starting to get a little more level. And it's exciting to kind of be at the forefront of that.
Yeah, it's so exciting. Like now it's probably like the best time to be in climate.
Yeah, I love that. Well, that's a great place to leave it. Helena, thank you so much for joining me, for demystifying this whole process of grant writing. We want folks to feel like this is something that is accessible to them. So hopefully as they listen to this, as they hear this, they can reach out to you, they can find Streamline, and they can be a part of this grant writing process, because the opportunity is out there. It's really about going after it.
Yeah. Thanks, Jay, for having me.
Thank you so much.